In this section, I want to cover a couple of key issues that come up in multiple row ordering games. The first is multi-row blocks. The second is about relative order rules. And the third is about the concept of thinking about the negative and positive aspects of a rule. Let's start with multi-row blocks. In this game, we're told Teethbright is releasing 8 new products this year, 4 toothbrushes and 4 mouthwashes. And because each of 4 fiscal quarters will have 1 toothbrush and 1 mouthwash, that's why I've just drawn this as 2 separate rows. A toothbrush row on the top and a mouthwash row on the bottom. The first rule here says B is released in the same quarter as Y. So B is a toothbrush, Y is a mouthwash. If they're in the same quarter, then that means they'll vertically appear in the same spot. So B is a toothbrush and Y is a mouthwash, and so that means visually it's going to look like this. B is going to be directly above Y, no matter whether it's in 1, 2, 3, or 4. So that's how I want to diagram this first rule. This is a block that spans both of the rows here, and it's very common in this kind of game. Now you can also get more complicated blocks that span both of the rows, but that also tell you something about the before and after relationship. Take a look at the second rule. W is released in the quarter before the quarter in which B is released. So W is a mouthwash and B is a toothbrush. So visually what this rule means is if you put a W down in, let's say 1, this is going to be the quarter before the quarter B is released. The B would have to go in the immediately next quarter. So that's why if you were diagramming this rule and you didn't already realize that you could connect it to the first rule, you'd probably want to do something like this. This visually captures what this relationship would look like in the diagram. And that's what you should always be striving to do with your rules. Now you might notice here that these two rules you could actually just combine because you know that the Y is going to be the mouthwash that's directly below the B. So it's probably better to just go directly to drawing this based on rules 1 and 2. Now, as with blocks in other kinds of ordering games, a block in a multiple row ordering game can be really restrictive, and so we want to make sure we think about where this block can go before we go to the questions. Right now, it looks like the WY could go in 1, 2, 2, 3, and 3, 4, and so I'd already be thinking about splitting the game based on this block, but that of course would depend on the other rules that we get. Now let's turn to the issue of relative order, and I've added a new rule here. This rule says that A cannot be released in an earlier quarter than W. Now you want to be careful not to think that this automatically means that A has to come after or later than W. And that's because A is a toothbrush and W is a mouthwash and they're on different rows. If they were part of the same category, then yeah, saying that it can't be released earlier than W in this game would mean that it has to come after W. But there's another way that the A might not come earlier than W. You could either have A in the same quarter as W, or you could have A after W. If you're reading too fast and not thinking carefully, you might only be thinking about this possibility. So I like to diagram this relationship like this. It captures the two possibilities. A is either with W in the same quarter or A is going to be coming to the right of W. And notice that I visually put the A above the W. That's because the A is going to be above the W in the diagram. Now let's take a look at the last rule here which I've added, which says C cannot be released in the same quarter as Z. So C is a toothbrush, Z is a mouthwash. That's why visually what this rule means is you cannot put letter C immediately above Z. But if I saw this rule, I would mentally note that when it comes to making connections and inferences, I do want to think about what C could go with. I do want to think about what's the toothbrush that Z could go with. What could go above Z? What could go below C? And that's the idea of taking a rule that is phrased in the negative, that is phrased about what's not allowed, and thinking about it in terms of the positive, about what is allowed. That's actually what we did with rule number 3, which started off by saying what's not allowed, A cannot be released earlier than W, but it's much more useful to think about that relationship in terms of what is allowed, A is with W or after W. So let's think about this rule more when we start making inferences. Now before we move on, I do want to note that letter D and letter X are free agent variables, and now we're ready to make some inferences. So remember, letter C is not allowed to go with Z. But who is allowed to go with letter C then? If there's a quarter with C, the toothbrush, we know that you can't have Z as the mouthwash in that quarter. Are you allowed to have Y as the mouthwash in that quarter? Well, no, because Y goes with B. We're already told that Y goes with B, and you can't see multiple Ys. So Y's not an option. The X looks like it's an option because it's a free agent variable, and the W also looks like it's an option because the A doesn't have to go with it. If the A goes somewhere else, then the W is free to go with another letter. So that's why we know this C can go with either W or X below it. And this could be an easier way to understand the rule instead of just saying that C can't go with Z. Now, can we think about this rule from Z's perspective? If you have Z, the mouthwash, you know that you're not allowed to have C, the toothpaste, above it. But it looks like you could have A. Now, because the first rule says B goes with Y, we also know that B is not going to be going above Z like this. That is not allowed, because you can't see more than one B. So that means the options for Z here are either going to be A or D. And again, this is probably going to be an easier way of handling rule number 4 than just leaving it like this. So I would take time to think about the positive meaning of what rule 4 means. Now, if there's too many possibilities, if the Z could go with 3 other letters, then it's probably not as useful to draw this. But if you can see that there's only 2 different possibilities for something, I think it's easier to understand that relationship in the positive rather than just leaving it in the negative. Now, if this were a real game at this point, I'd probably split the game into worlds based on the WY block, because there's only 3 possibilities for where that block goes, 1, 2, 2, 3, or 3, 4. And for me at least, it's going to help me visualize the other rules if I just sketch those 3 possibilities out. But for the purpose of this exercise, let me just go ahead and leave this unsplit. I'll circle the relationships that I still have to keep track of, and now let's take a look at an example problem. Go ahead and pause the video, try this on your own, and we'll discuss when you're back. So this question says, if X is released in the second quarter, what is the complete and accurate assignment of toothbrushes and mouthwashes? So basically, figure everything out if you can. Let's start by putting X in the second quarter. X is a mouthwash, so it'll go over here. And now the next step is to think about our big block relationship. If you have a block, that is almost certainly going to be the first thing to think about after you put down the condition of a problem, particularly if you don't have any rules that mention that letter that was in the condition. So where could this WYB block go? Well, WY is going to be forced into 3, 4. That means B will have to go with Y and 4. And now you're done with this block. Let's move to the next rule. A is either with W or after W. Well, there's no room for the A after W, so that means the A has to go with W. And now let's take a look at the last rule. C is with either W or X. And right now, the W is already going with A, so that means the C has to go with X. C has to go over here. And that's because if you tried to put the C over here, well, then it would be forced to go with the Z, which is the only other mouthwash. So that's why C is with X in quarter 2, and that leaves the final toothpaste, which is D, to go over here. So this is the complete assignment. Here's another challenge for you. Go ahead and try this on your own, and we'll discuss when you're back. This says if B is released in the quarter before the quarter in which C is released, how many different arrangements of toothbrushes are possible? Let's start with the condition. B and C are both toothbrushes, so visually this means B is going to be immediately to the left of C, because it's in the quarter before it. Now we have a rule about B. The B has to go with Y as the mouthwash, and W will go immediately before this. So we actually have a really big block here. And since we have a really big block here, it makes sense to think about where this block can go. It looks like the WY is either going to go in 1, 2, or it's going to go in 2, 3 with the C in 4. So I would absolutely just draw both of those possibilities out. Here I'll put the WYBC like this, and down here I'll put the WYBC like this. So now we've split the work for this question into 2 worlds, and let's start making deductions in the first world. We know that A is either with W or after W, so right now it looks like the A can go in either 1 or 4. The last rule says C is either with W or X, and right now the C is already over here and it's not going to be with the W. So that means C has to go with X, and that leaves only one more mouthwash. That's going to be our Z over here. So now the only other toothpaste to account for is letter D here, and there's no rule about D, so there's nothing preventing D from going with W or with Z, that means the A and the D are going to be switching off like this. Now let's take a look at our second world. And again, let's think about the A and W. A is either with W or after W. Well, there's no room for the A after W, so that means A will have to go with W like this. The next rule says C is either with W or X, and again, C is not with W, so that means C has to go with X, and that leaves only the D and the Z to go together like that. So now the question is, how many different arrangements of toothbrushes to quarters are possible? Well, this is one possible arrangement over here, D, A, B, C. And the first world here captures two other possibilities. Either you're going to have A, B, C, D, or you're going to have D, B, C, A. So that's why the answer to this question is there are three different possible arrangements of toothbrushes to quarters.